Jimmy Don Beets was shot twice in the head while dozing in his recliner. Never knowing his wife had already decided he was worth more dead than alive. The 62-year-old grandmother would spend 15 years fighting for her life in the courts before Texas strapped her to a gurney and ended the debate with 3 chemical injections. But Betty Lou Beets wasn't your typical death row inmate. She had buried 2 husbands in her backyard, staged an elaborate drowning cover-up, and fooled search teams for nearly 2 years. When investigators finally dug up her front yard, they found more than just Jimmy's body. They uncovered a pattern that stretched back decades, linking Betty to a trail of missing men who had all made the same mistake. They had married her. This is a story of how a woman with 6 marriages and a history of shooting her husbands managed to convince an entire community that her latest spouse had simply fallen overboard during a fishing accident. How she sat calmly in her living room while rescue crews dragged Cedar Creek Lake for weeks, searching for a man who was buried just outside her front door. Betty's case would become one of the most controversial executions in Texas history. Her daughters would plead that she was a victim of domestic violence who fought back against abusive men. Prosecutors would argue she was a black widow who killed for insurance money. The truth, as investigators would discover, was far more complex than either side wanted to admit. This isn't just about murder. It's about how someone can hide in plain sight for decades, using marriage as a weapon and turning her own home into a graveyard. It's about the moment when a tip from an anonymous caller brought down a house of secrets that had stood for nearly 2 years. The story begins with a man who thought he was going fishing and ends with the execution of the woman who made sure he never came home. But to understand how Betty Lou Beets, a grandmother in her 60s, ended up taking a man's life in such calculated fashion, we need to step back and examine the thread of violence that had been weaving through her story for decades. Because Jimmy wasn't her first victim. He wasn't even her first husband to die under suspicious circumstances. Betty's childhood had been marked by hardship from the very beginning. She lost most of her hearing as a young girl, officially from measles, though she would later claim the damage came from something far more sinister. When Betty was just 12 years old, her mother was committed to a psychiatric hospital, leaving Betty to raise her younger siblings. Her childhood disappeared overnight, replaced by responsibilities that would have broken many adults. At 15, Betty married for the first time. Robert Branson became a father of 6 of her children, and for 17 years, they lived in a cycle of separation and reconciliation that finally ended in divorce in 1969. But even then, Betty's pattern with men had already begun to take shape. Violence seemed to follow her relationships like a shadow she couldn't shake. Betty's rap sheet grew longer with each passing year. Public lewdness charges, firearms violations, and a reputation for explosive anger followed her wherever she went. When Jimmy Don Beets entered Betty's life, he was walking into a trap he couldn't possibly have seen coming. Jimmy was a Dallas firefighter, a man who had spent 26 years saving lives and protecting his community. He had friends, co-workers who respected him, and a pension waiting for his retirement. He also had something else that caught Betty's attention. A life insurance policy worth around $110,000. On August 6, 1983, Betty sat in her isolated home near Cedar Creek Lake with Jimmy and her son Robbie. The house provided the perfect cover for what she had been planning. No neighbors close enough to hear gunshots. No witnesses to ask uncomfortable questions. Betty pulled Robbie aside and told him she was finished with Jimmy, that she couldn't continue the marriage. Then she said something that would haunt her son for years to come. Jimmy had to die tonight. She told Robbie to leave, and he did, stepping outside into the Texas evening, without looking back. Inside, Jimmy dozed in his recliner, the television casting soft patterns of light across the room. He had no idea that his wife was moving through their home with a loaded pistol in her hand. There was no argument, no final confrontation. Betty simply walked into the room, raised a gun, and fired twice. Both shots struck Jimmy in the head, killing him instantly. When Robbie returned 2 hours later, he found his mother standing calmly beside Jimmy's lifeless body. There was no panic in her eyes, no tears or signs of distress. She looked like someone who had just completed a routine task. Betty didn't need to explain what had happened. She simply said 4 words that would echo in the courtroom years later. "Help me get rid of the body." The wishing well in their front yard had been built that very summer. Jimmy and Robbie had constructed it together, working through the sweltering Texas heat to create what they thought would be a decorative addition to their property. Neither could have imagined it would become Jimmy's tomb. They lowered his body into the pit, wrapped him carefully, sealed the opening with bricks, and poured concrete over the top. When they finished, the well looked exactly as it had before, a perfect piece of yard art hiding a perfect crime. But Betty wasn't finished. She had created a murder, but now she needed to create a story. By morning, she had figured out exactly how Jimmy Don Beets would disappear without raising suspicion. At the harbor, she crushed Jimmy's heart medication and scattered the powder across the deck of his fishing boat. Robbie removed the propeller to simulate a mechanical failure. Then they pushed the boat into Cedar Creek Lake and watched it drift away, carrying with it the fiction of Jimmy's accidental death. When Jimmy's overturned boat was discovered floating in the lake that evening, Betty played the role of the concerned wife perfectly. She answered the phone when the marina called. She drove down to identify the boat. She confirmed that yes, Jimmy had gone fishing the evening before and never returned. She even added a crucial detail about the boat having mechanical problems, information that would drive the massive search effort that followed. For 3 weeks, rescue crews from across Texas dragged Cedar Creek Lake, looking for Jimmy Don Beets. Firefighters from Dallas, men who had worked alongside Jimmy for decades, joined the search for their missing friend. Local fire departments, the Henderson County Sheriff's Office, and volunteers with boats and diving equipment all participated in what became one of the largest search operations in the area's history. They used helicopters, professional divers, and every piece of technology available. They found nothing because there was nothing to find. Throughout the search, Betty maintained her distance. She didn't join the volunteers at the lake or spend time with the other families waiting for news. Instead, she asked very specific questions about Jimmy's life insurance policy and pension benefits. Denny Burrows, the fire department chaplain who had known Jimmy for years, noticed something troubling about Betty's priorities. She never asked if they had found Jimmy's boots or whether the divers were still searching. She wanted to know about money. Lots of money. The insurance payout would be substantial, over $100,000, plus a monthly pension of $1,200. But there was a catch that Betty hadn't anticipated. Without a body, Texas law required a 7-year waiting period before any benefits could be paid. Betty would have to wait, and waiting had never been her strong suit. For nearly 2 years, the case remained closed. Jimmy Don Beets had apparently drowned in a fishing accident, his body lost in the depths of Cedar Creek Lake. Betty continued living in their isolated home, sitting on her deadly secret. But secrets have a way of surfacing, especially when they're buried in your front yard. In the spring of 1985, an anonymous tip reached the Henderson County Sheriff's Office. The caller suggested that Jimmy's death might not have been accidental, and that Betty might know more than she had told investigators. The tip was quiet, specific, and impossible to ignore. When deputies arrived at Betty's home on June 8th with a search warrant, they had no idea they were about to uncover one of the most shocking crime scenes in Texas history. Under the concrete and bricks, investigators found human remains that had been shot twice in the head. It was Jimmy Don Beets, buried just steps from his own front door. But the discovery that truly stunned even seasoned officers came when they expanded their search behind the house. Under a storage shed, badly decomposed and hidden deep in the soil, lay the remains of Doyle Wayne Barker, Betty's fourth husband who had supposedly left her in 1981. Both men had been killed with the same weapon, a .38 caliber collector's pistol that officers had already removed from Betty's house 2 years earlier. The ballistics match was perfect, connecting Betty to both murders with scientific certainty. 2 husbands, both dead, both buried on property she controlled. The pattern was undeniable. When the case went to trial, Betty's defense team tried desperately to shift blame to her son Robbie. Maybe he had killed Jimmy and forced his mother to help cover it up. Maybe Betty was another victim in this story, not the perpetrator. But when Robbie took the witness stand, he destroyed that theory with devastating testimony. He told the jury exactly what happened on the night of August 6, 1983. His mother had told him she was going to kill Jimmy. She had sent him away. When he returned, Jimmy was already dead, and Betty was standing over the body with no emotion whatsoever. Robbie said he'd kept quiet for almost 2 years to protect his mother, but now he needed to protect himself. His final characterization of Betty was simple and damning. He called her a very selfish woman. The jury believed every word. On October 11, 1985, they found Betty Lou Beets guilty of murdering Jimmy Don Beets for insurance money. 3 days later, she was sentenced to death. But Betty wasn't ready to accept her fate quietly. Her appeals process would drag on for 15 years, winding through every level of court system. At one point, a judge even overturned her death sentence, ruling that insurance payouts didn't qualify as remuneration under Texas law. But that victory was short-lived. The ruling was reversed, and Betty's case continued its journey through the appeals process, eventually reaching the Supreme Court and back down again. By early 2000, every legal avenue had been exhausted. Betty's time was running out. In her final days, her daughters made one last desperate plea to save their mother's life. They appeared before the state parole board carrying photographs of a woman who was bruised, swollen, and broken. They claimed these images told the real story of Betty's life, that she'd been a victim of abuse from every man she had married, that her violence had been born from years of suffering that nobody had bothered to see or understand. The parole board was unmoved. On February 24th, 2000, Betty Lou Beets was transferred to the Huntsville unit for execution. When offered the opportunity to request a final meal, she declined. She had very little to say to anyone in those final hours. Her attorney would later admit that Betty was terrified, that she didn't want to be strapped to the gurney alone, facing death without anyone who truly cared about her. In the witness room, Jimmy's son Jamie watched a woman who had murdered his father. He later described Betty's demeanor as completely emotionless. She didn't look scared or remorseful. She simply lay on the gurney as if it were any other day. When asked for a final statement, Betty remained silent. No apologies, no explanations, no acknowledgement of the lives she had taken or the family she had destroyed. As the lethal chemicals began to flow through the four-line, Betty offered only a small smile to her attorney and pastor. Then came 2 coughs, a sharp intake of breath, and stillness. At 6:18 p.m., Betty Lou Beets was pronounced dead. She was 62 years old. The case of Betty Lou Beets raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of domestic violence, the cycle of abuse, and the point at which a victim becomes a perpetrator. Betty's daughters insisted their mother had been brutalized by the men in her life, that her violence was reactive rather than predatory. But the evidence suggested something far more calculated. The planning involved in Jimmy's murder, the elaborate cover-up of the fishing boat, the patient way she had buried 2 men in her yard and continued living above their graves all pointed to someone who killed not from desperation, but from greed. Jimmy Don Beets had dedicated his life to saving others as a Dallas firefighter. He deserved better than to die alone in his living room, killed by the woman who had promised to love him. Doyle Wayne Barker, whatever his flaws, didn't deserve to be shot and buried like garbage behind his own home. And the families of both men deserved answers, not the elaborate fiction Betty had constructed to hide her crimes. In the end, Betty Lou Beets took her secrets to the grave. She never explained why she had chosen murder over divorce, why insurance money had been worth more than human life, or how she had managed to sleep peacefully in a house built on top of 2 graves. Her silence in those final moments spoke louder than any confession ever could have. Some people kill in passion, others in desperation. Betty Lou Beets killed for money, and when the state of Texas finally called in that debt, she paid it with her life.